You are about to witness a global movement. The medical system has failed us. Pharmaceuticals are designed to make us sick, weak, dependent. Not anymore. This is the Medicine Girl podcast with renowned healing expert and registered nurse Robin Stebbins. Every week, we shine the light on new ways to heal your body from the root, ignite your inner healer, and tap into your divine wisdom. Begin to live harmoniously with your mind, body, and spirit. You are stronger than you think, braver than you realize. Now is the time to wake up and start living healthier, wealthier, and laugh out loud happier. And here we go.
Hello and welcome to the Medicine Girl podcast. It's me, Robin Stebbins, and I am here today with the wonderful Travis Stock.
Hi.
Hi, Travis. You have so many accolades that I didn't feel comfortable writing all of them down and trying to figure out which ones you want to share. And so can you just give us a little bit about your background, especially your coach training versus master's level therapy, because I kind of want to get into that conversation also.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you first for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And both of us are podcast hosts, so it's super fun to be able to sort of jam with you in this space. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And really quick, what's your podcast in case anyone stops listening, they can jump over to yours?
Well, I don't advise anybody to stop listening, but it's called the New Masculine Podcast. And it's a podcast dedicated to disrupting outdated models of masculinity in service of new ways forward for us as men. So it's gathering together with other men to start having conversations about what's not working in terms of our societal and cultural ideals around masculinity and sort of trying to figure out a way to move forward in new ways.
Yeah, and it's absolutely brilliant. I highly recommend it. I've listened to almost all of them because I think you said on Facebook or something, it might make you smarter. It's definitely made me smarter.
Oh yeah, I was featured on an HR and coaching company's their newsletter, and they had put out on their newsletter, it's their monthly, they feature "This podcast might make you smarter," and so I just stole that line from them a little bit. What's the worst could happen? You might be smarter.
Yeah, and it happened. I feel great. Smarter.
Well, thank you so much for listening and checking it out. So my background, I have a master's in social work. So I've always sort of been in the helping professions. I started in the child welfare specialization. And so I was really working sometimes as a behavior coach with children, was sort of working on behavioral issues that were not to the level that needed inpatient treatment or anything like that, but it was sort of like behavior modification in home and at school. But then I also worked as an investigator for Child Protective Services for several years. So I was investigating abuse and neglect for children. And what I found in my work, and that was really challenging because I was working within a system that's quite punitive and is quite, the clients that are there are not necessarily there voluntarily. They're there for court mandated or because a report has been called in on them. And so the ability to affect change and the ability to support people felt really challenging to me, to be able to actually make a difference in their life, especially with a system where we're just trying to punish people for their bad choices rather than actually support them in making the changes that would actually benefit them and their families. And there were so many comorbid issues like poverty and drug use and mental health issues that were not being addressed. And so to just assume that people are going to stop the cycle of abuse and neglect in their family lines is really challenging. And so while I was good at the job, it was not good for me. I burnt out on it pretty quickly after a few years. And I started looking for other ways to be of help and support. And what I ended up finding was who became my mentors in terms of coaching. And so in 2012, I moved to California and lived on a horse ranch in the middle of nowhere in the central coast of California, and trained as a life coach in two different programs. One as just a kind of the normal run-of-the-mill coach that does phone sessions or in-person sessions, but then I also trained to do a version of coaching called Equus coaching, that it takes all of the coaching skills and blends it with the experiential learning impact of building a relationship with a horse and getting feedback from an animal that doesn't speak the same language as you do. And so, so I have, I'm a master coach in both levels of that. I teach for the coach training that taught me the Equus coaching work that I do. So I'm a lead instructor for that program as well. It's called the Coel Institute for Equus Coaching. And so we run two levels of a course, a standard level that teaches coaches how to do one-on-one client work with horses, and then one that teaches, the master level teaches how to do group work and group workshops with Equus coaching involved.
So that kind of brings me to, we had an earlier conversation about what's the difference between, and I think a lot of people don't know this, what's the difference between, say, I hire you to coach me versus I need some help on a deeper level of healing maybe some trauma from my past. So I might seek out a therapist.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite soapboxes to stand on in the coaching world, because I do come from the educational background that has the more therapeutic model with a master's in social work. And then now I'm a coach. I think it is important for people to delineate the difference between the two. They are very parallel industries and they borrow skills from each other. And yet they serve a different function for different people at different moments in their lives. And so the quick, candid way that I've heard to describe it that I really resonate with is that therapy is really much more focused on the past. What are the experiences that created you who you are right now? If there's anything unresolved in that, let's go back and do some work on some of those memories and those experiences to see if we can benefit your current situation. Coaching, on the other hand, is a little bit more present and future focused. So meaning, who are you right now and where are you going? What do you want out of your life? That doesn't mean that as a coach, I don't dip into the past and figure out, I think there's total value in finding where our patterns come from, but then also to actually like turn our gaze and our vision forward and say, okay, well, what do we want to do with that moving forward? How do we want to impact our lives? A nice analogy that I usually hear is a therapist is much more like a doctor that you go to when you're sick, whereas a coach is much more like a personal trainer that helps you work on your physical goals. My job is to help you work on your personal, professional, relationship, spirituality goals and what you sort of want to work on in your life. Now, I say the word goals, but I'm not typically the most like that very traditional masculine style of coaching, which is like set goals, hold you accountable, have deadlines, do that kind of thing. I think there's value to that for some people. As a coach, I'm much more interested in stripping away all of those things on the outside world that we think we want, or our egos want, or that those achievement-based things, and get in right relationship with self. I think that's one of the things I really try to focus on is this internal relationship and how that mirrors out into the outside world.
That really resonates with me. I like how we can differentiate the two, because there's specific things that I don't think you really should go to a coach for. If you're struggling with addiction or you're struggling with eating disorders or that kind of thing, it might need something bigger. Not that you can't do coaching in conjunction with therapy. That can be beneficial too.
Yeah, I actually think they work really well together. I have several clients that I'm working with that are working with a therapist on some of their trauma-related things.
Yeah.
And then they work with me on some of their like goals and of what they're wanting to create in their world. And I think that they're really complementary. And like you said, I do think active addictions, eating disorders, suicidal ideations, those are all things that aren't really met, that a coach doesn't really actively work on. Acute trauma, things that are really going on right now, domestic violence things. It's not really the place for coaching. Doesn't mean that a coach can't benefit that person at some point, but just at that point of their life, that's much more suited for crisis interventionists and therapists and psychiatrists, people that have the educational background. Because the thing with coaching is that coaching doesn't have a governing body.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. And we as consumers need to be very discerning about if a coach does want to coach you through these issues, that should be kind of a red flag. And it can get into some muddy waters and be a little dangerous at times, especially with people that have the suicidal ideation, or if it's kind of the narcissistic personality, sociopath or psychopath, then they can sort of pretend to have these issues and it becomes a big problem.
Yeah.
Make the person worse.
It's important for clients that are going to coaches to be aware of this, but it's also important for us as coaches. Like one of the things in the coach training I teach for, I really try to emphasize that a lot, that it's like, it's not our job to try to work with every single issue. If it's outside of your wheelhouse or your experience level,
yes,
it's time to refer out, because you can actually do more damage by trying to get in there and do work that you're not prepared to do.
Yes.
And coaching is interesting because I obviously value it a lot, but there's no governing body that says what you can and can't do in coaching, like there is with social workers and therapists and like the licensure processes that they have to go through.
Mm-hmm.
And so anybody can call themselves a coach and can just start working on it. Somebody that has no experience with sexual abuse trauma might start trying to work with people who have had some sexual abuse trauma in their childhood.
Yeah.
And I just don't know that that's actually a very ethical thing to do.
It's not necessarily ethical, but I think a lot of times what I see with certain coaches is if they've transcended or feel like they've transcended an issue on their own, now they get really excited. Now I'm going to help everybody because I know what it was like. Well, you don't, you know what it was like for you.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to educate, and you're making conscious decisions about what you want and where you want to go versus being puppet stringed by certain limiting beliefs, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, I very much think it's what's needed in our world right now. I think there's a lot of conversations going on around sort of patriarchal societies and whether capitalism is working at all. And there's a lot of these conversations because there are shadow elements to patriarchy and to capitalism that are real, and we're dealing with the consequences. We're taxing ourselves, each other, this environment. We're really struggling. And I think that that being in a patriarchal and capitalist society really trains our minds to be thinking about those achievement-based things. What's the next way I'm going to get more money and more this and more status and a better body and a better this and a better this. And
we're creating this hungry ghost that will never be satisfied.
That's such a good way to put it, a hungry ghost.
Yeah, and I think Jim Carrey put it really well. I don't have the quote memorized, but he said, I wish people could actualize their dreams of success and fame and money and realize that's not where it is. Yeah. Because once you get all those things, it's like, now what? Okay, now I got to be even hungrier and start accumulating more. And we just end up depleting and exhausting ourselves. And perfect segue though, when you're talking about the patriarchal society. And I think personally, anything that's too dominant on one side or the other will not sustain itself. We need a balance. We need the balance of the masculine and feminine. And I don't think a lot of people, especially people I talk to when I do coaching with men, they don't understand that they have masculine and feminine, and they get really upset when you start talking about the feminine part of them. I'm not feminine at all. What are you talking about? Or they get very taken aback, worried. Am I insinuating that there's something feminine about them? Because that's so pushed down in most of the men that I grew up with and older, that was such a taboo thing to even be close to the feminine part of yourself. You had to shun that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if anybody checks out my podcast, you'll hear in the intro of it that I talk about how we as men are raised to reject everything that's associated with the feminine. We can't have feelings. We're not allowed to be weak. We're not allowed to ask for help. We're not allowed to have intimacy between men, or else then you're gay, or then you're labeled as something that's very critical. And I think that's been a challenging part of my own journey, was to sort of find the balance of the masculine and feminine energies in myself, because as a gay man myself, I hid a lot of the feminine qualities of myself for a long time as a way of staying safe. Those were the things that gave me away, that people I couldn't hide with those. And so I spent a lot of time coping by hiding those things. I ended up finding myself really depressed and struggling a lot in my 20s as a result. And so my journey and my healing journey and my transformation journey has really been about how to find balance between the masculine and feminine energies inside of myself that has nothing to do with my gender expression, my sexuality. It just is the way that,
yeah, I really want to make that point too. It brings up another idea I had too, especially when I'm talking to a lot of my guy friends. As a woman, I felt like I had freedom to explore whether I was gay or not, if I liked women, if I liked men. I felt like my peers, my male peers, my brothers, they didn't have that freedom. Right. Because the worst thing that you could be as a young boy is gay. And I still see it in some of my son's friends. They still have a little bit of the homophobia, but it's gotten a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very valid thing. And I think that is something that I notice, is that women do have a little more flexibility in their ability to own different sides of themselves, masculine, feminine, explore more sexually. There's more freedom in female culture to blur the line.
Yes.
There's also a lot of challenges and really hard things about being a woman in this culture. There's one place where there's a little bit more freedom to explore. And what I find is men have a very narrow lane that we're allowed to fit in. And there's really two archetypes that we're allowed to fit into: the protector and the provider.
Right.
And what happens if you're not the provider? What happens if your partner makes more money than you? What happens if you're not a fighter and you're much more of a lover as a man?
Right. Or a very effeminate straight man that has very feminine qualities, but yet you're straight. So and I think then, and what I really want to talk about with this podcast is, who cares if I balance my masculine and feminine? Who cares if you're not allowed to express your feminine side? Why does it matter?
Yeah. Well, the framework that I'm really starting to work with that helps me communicate this to men or to anybody who's struggling to differentiate the balance of masculine and feminine from gender. Because as a culture, we're going through a very gender transformational thing. We've got a lot of folks that are identifying as non-binary, a lot of people that are deconstructing what the sort of that male-female binary.
Right.
And it's confusing because now we're using language to describe energy that also fits within that sort of binary style. And yet what I think of it as much more of a continuum of energy. And it's the yin, the yang. It's the night versus day. It's the balance between things that allows for differentiation and separation and allows for differences and positive differences in all of us. And so there's lots of words to describe the feminine, such nurturing, caring, creative. It's where life is built. It's collaborative. It's development oriented. And for the masculine, it's much more forward moving and directional and goal oriented and individual. And so there's lots of words to describe the two of them. The framework that I'm really working with lately to describe it is to really key into one different word that helps describe the masculine and one that describes the feminine. The masculine's job is to individuate. It helps us move forward. It helps us have a goal. It helps us have a personal idea of what I want to create in my world. And in its most balanced, beautiful place, it can be the king, it can be the lover, it can be the magician, all those archetypes that really represent beautiful qualities of the masculine, that are just rulers, that are benevolent men, and or women, because masculinity isn't based on gender. The masculinity as a social construct is, and how men are supposed to behave, but masculine energy is not necessarily gendered. And so masculine energy individuates, whereas feminine energy connects. And so individuates versus connects. And so if you push either of them to the extremes, they get out of balance, and you get either isolated on the masculine side, or you get enmeshed or stuck in the feminine if you overuse the feminine. And so what I like to do with my clients is help people find, what is your sweet spot? What's the right amalgamation of those energies for you? And you might be a man who has a sweet spot that tends a little more on the feminine, or you might be a woman that tends a little more strongly on the masculine. Myself, I'm a man whose power spot is a little on the feminine side of things. I'm much more interested in harmony, in collaboration, in connection, in emotions. I'm much more interested in empowering that, empowering the being versus the human doer out there in the world that's trying to achieve. But I also have decent amount of masculine energy. And so it's about helping you find where's your sweet spot and what are those things that pull you out of balance, either towards that enmeshment of the profane feminine or into the in the isolation of the profane masculine side.
And I have a personal example of that because the way I grew up, it wasn't safe for me growing up on a ranch. I didn't feel safe being feminine. I had to come in guns a-blazing. I had to be the hardest worker in the room. I had to be tough as nails. I was the one that wasn't going to cry. So that was my safety net. And I thought that was my power. And I led with the masculine. And, I have a truck and I feel very comfortable in my masculine side. But I suppress the feminine 100%. Except for the way I dress and the way I look. That's just a little bit of a surface, maybe 1% to 2%. The rest is like, I'm coming in strong. And suppressing that feminine side not only got me out of balance and out of harmony in everything else, but it was my power. There was a lot of power in my femininity, and I was attracting different men into my life that took advantage because that was so out of balance.
Yeah. I mean, I had plenty of my own experiences with sort of vacillating between the extremes of the masculine and feminine and being very isolated and independent versus being completely enmeshed and codependent. Like I had lots of relationships that were a lot about how do I fit in this other person's world rather than how do they fit in mine? And I was completely codependent and enmeshed with my partners and have had to do a lot of work around that concept. And for me, it's been a process of swinging the pendulum from side to side, figuring out where is the right balance for me and coming to an understanding of where my sweet spot is.
Yeah.
And I really like helping other clients find that too, and knowing that each of our sweet spots might have a slightly different amalgamation of the different balance of energies between us. But where are you most powerfully creative and a part of this world and in your community and creative?
Yes. Yeah. And what would just a really simple explanation. I work with a lot of older adults. And a lot of older men. And a lot of them are now watching my podcasts. So what would you say to, and a lot of them are, 65 plus, that generation that has suppressed the feminine for pretty much their entire lives, but maybe want to explore getting themselves back in a more harmonious state?
Yeah, well, the place that I like to start with people, it's actually a post I had made on social media yesterday about if you could give yourself permission to express something about yourself more, but you feel afraid to do so, what would it be? Just sort of identifying what that is. For me lately, I've sort of noticed that I have suppressed a bit of my emotional experience, like my genuine, authentic emotion in the moment. And I think that's based on a lifetime of being the sensitive boy and trying to hide and be more masculine. There's like a series of things where I was this became a coping strategy, was to put some space between me and my sort of emotional expression. But I am a sensitive boy. Right. And reclaiming that and making sure that that's a part of my strength and making space for that. I want to give myself permission to be more in the moment authentic with my emotions rather than putting this space where my mind can come in and analyze and present it perfectly so that people will like me and want to be around me. Once I notice that I'm doing a bit, it doesn't come from a bad place, but I'm doing a bit of manipulation to try to get people to really like me and to accept me, then I know I'm on to myself, I'm playing a game with reality. Right. I'm not actually feeling safe enough to show up fully. Mm-hmm. And so now I really want to look at that. I want to look at closing the gap between my emotional response and what I'm willing to show. And I think that in all the conversations I keep having with men on the podcast and with my clients is that we all feel a bit isolated out there. We are disconnected from each other. We really don't know how to connect with other men. And yet there's this big craving for men to connect with each other and to share with each other.
Yes.
And to share what's on our heart and to be vulnerable. And yet it doesn't feel safe. We've been hazed out of that our entire lives. And so one of the things that keeps coming up as a theme in the conversations that I'm having is that I know it feels scary to be vulnerable. I know it feels scary to dive inward and look internally at what's going on with you. And it feels like it's going to be a subtractive process. You're going to lose people. You're going to lose yourself. You're going to get lost in your emotions. And yet every single man that I've talked to shares that once they move through that fear, it becomes such an additive process. Their relationships get better. Their feelings of belonging get better. Their support system that helps them move forward in their goals and what they're creating in the world gets better. And so it's not a subtractive process. It is totally an additive process. But you've been conditioned over time to believe that it is a scary thing that you should avoid at all times. And this is a marker of bravery and masculinity to move through that fear and show up in a new way.
And that's what I try to really express to the men that I'm working with, is that is the warrior. The warrior is the one that shows up vulnerable. It's easy to hide behind a facade. It's easy to have this tough exterior. You know, just try sharing one thing to another guy that might just be a little sensitive. See how scary that is. See how hard that is to do. Then you know that's.
Yeah, it absolutely. I think redefining what brave and strong is what we're doing in terms of masculinity in our culture. Because I actually think it's the easiest thing to move towards anger and towards aggression and dominance. Absolutely. I think that's the easy reaction. The harder thing to do is to sit with your emotions, is to be more self-aware, is to develop emotional intelligence, is to keep your heart open even when the world feels scary and makes you want to close it. That's the definition of masculinity that I'm playing with, is
I agree.
Integrates that feminine space of the heart, not just the mind and the body that's aggressive, but really incorporates the heart as well.
Yeah, and I like what you said about that, because I think the old paradigm that we have of what masculine is, you know, it's the John Wayne and the Clint Eastwood kind of archetypes, where it's just, I'm got no emotions and shoot first, ask questions later.
Yeah, and I think that's a journey for all of us to really, that's not just a male thing. I think we all have an inner child that throws a tantrum, and we may do it a little differently, and men tend towards aggression and anger, whereas women might tend towards something else. But that's just social conditioning. That's what we were taught is acceptable. Or women may turn it inward, where men turn it outward with anger.
Yes. Yeah. And that's an interesting conversation too, maybe for another time. But I know as women, we're shamed for expressing anger outwardly, and the names that we get called. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to find an appropriate way to express anger without being called crazy, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's like, I guess everything in nature, it doesn't just stagnate at the sweet spot. You know, we're going to cycle through the little pendulum back and forth. So, I'm a little too masculine now. That's not resonating with my soul. I'm going to bring in more feminine. And for me, since I kind of suppressed that for so many years, it's finding out what is that side of me, allowing it to come forward a little more authentically, instead of what, again, it's easy to just go with paradigms. Mm-hmm. So feminine is like, is that just girly stuff? Is it, what is the feminine? And I read something a while ago about the feminine is more like the storm. The storm of creativity, and the masculine takes that storm and kind of extracts, the way to extract the electricity to use for a light. So it's like taking that creative energy and actually then 1 + 2 + 3, you know, we take the appropriate steps to enact that vision.
Yeah. That metaphor makes sense to me. It's like the storm is the pure potential and the creative life force,
Yeah.
which is within the feminine, and the masculine directs it and makes it and puts it to use and
Yes.
and hones it a bit. That makes sense to me too.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to keep them in balance.
Yeah.
Because you can't just, you know, put your head down and do, which I've seen a lot of my friends and patients, and then they wake up to enjoy their retirement and find their bodies decrepit. They have
Totally.
no hobbies because they haven't spent any time developing hobbies. They have no friends because they've gone to work and come home and been the provider. So I think all of that just comes into keeping ourselves in harmony.
Yeah, and I think that finding that balance is a very brave thing to do as male or female or somewhere or non-binary or trans. It is the hardest thing for us to do because there are traps that our culture sets for us based on our gender identity.
Yes.
Like for women, you can't express anger, or you're the bitch, or you're too much of like you're
Yes.
like you get labeled a lot of things for expressing anger. Whereas men is if you express vulnerably and emotionally, you're weak and you don't have
Right.
anything to offer. And so there are traps for all of us that are set that our minds will convince us we can't break that rule, or else we will be rejected or not belong or not receive love or not have value as a human being.
Yep.
And I think that the work is really to disconnect from our social conditioning and really define some of these things for ourselves. Define what bravery is for ourselves. Define what strength is for yourself. Define what how you want to use your anger, because anger can be a really powerful force. Most of us have only seen the destructive kind of anger, but it actually can be the birthplace of passion. It can be very creative, and it can seed change in the world, and it can help us reset boundaries if boundaries are crossed.
Absolutely. And I was just having a conversation with somebody about the difference. And there's a point where righteous anger needs to be expressed. So not just I'm upset with you and I'm losing control. I don't mean anger like that, but you've done something, you've crossed a line, you've infiltrated a boundary, and you're not backing up. Expressing righteous anger, if it stays in the body, it creates a disease process. And they have done studies with Tibetan monks where it's all love and light, which is great, and they do meditation, but you have to balance it. And they get a extraordinarily high rate of diabetes, not because of what they're eating, but it's because they have no outlet, and they've had some horrible things happen to them and their culture and oppression. And that has to be expressed in some way. You can't do it by just sending love to the enemy. Sometimes you have to be the lion, and you have to say that I gave you 4 warnings. Now you're going to see the dragon. And when I was talking to somebody else, I said, once the dragon's awake, for the most part, it's like, I just have to stand back and like hope things come out for the best. I'm trying to hone that anger so that I can wield it effectively and know that, you know, if worse comes to worse, I got this. You know, I've got that power behind me, and I've seen it. But I want to be able to wield it a little more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard a lot of really interesting research that's out there that correlates suppressed and repressed emotions with autoimmune disorders. And that's not a causation, but there's a lot of connection between the repressed emotions that we have stored in our body and the dis-ease that's created within that. And so I do think developing emotional intelligence around all of our emotions, including anger, I think in some time, like as you were saying, like sometimes in self-help, it can be really, anger can get a bad rap, and we can sort of, it's not good to be angry. It's not the spiritual Zen person to be. And yet it exists in all living beings. If you watch anything in nature, what I've learned in my work from horses is that they are on the prey end of the spectrum. And so they will choose to run away to create safety for themselves. and to a certain point. And if they're backed into a corner, they will express anger and they will send warning shots along, and that you'll get to see that it escalates to that place where they need to set a boundary for themselves and they need to take care of themselves. And so all animals do, not just the hunters of the world. It's the prey animals do too. Is that there's a part of anger that's an important God source, nature given kind of thing.
I completely agree. And being able to harness that energy effectively so that when I can now maybe express more of myself, I know I'm protected by myself.
Yeah.
So Dragon's back there, needs to wake up, but you just stay asleep for now. Everything, I got this. Everything's under control. But to be able to not care so much about what you think of me, I'm just singing my song now. And I'm starting to lose the need to seek validation. I showed somebody some of my paintings a while ago, and she didn't like them at all. And normally I would have been crushed, but I absolutely didn't care one iota because I really liked them. It didn't really matter to me what anyone else thought. And that was the first time that's ever happened. And it's happening more and more. And I think it's because when you were saying, you're a sensitive man, but you suppress that. So then it kind of blooms in other areas. And
it leaks out in other ways. I know.
And not so good ways.
Yeah, I know plenty of points in my 20s where anger seeped out in ways because I was trying to press it down. I was much more comfortable in sadness than I was in hurting myself and turning the anger inward and shaming myself. And then it would leak out in moments. And the reality is it's going to be there no matter what. You're either going to turn it outward and it's going to be directed at someone else, or you're going to turn it inward and it's going to look like shame.
Right.
So it's about developing a relationship to it. And I think that as you were sharing, like the anger sort of instead of being in that place of worrying about other people's, what they think and what they feel about your art, that sort of self-ownership that comes with that anger for you, that I can own my own value and my own self, that is that sort of bringing in a little bit more of the masculine energy to individuate you so that you're not enmeshed with the beliefs and the thoughts of the other person or what they value. And so you individuate a little bit by bringing a little bit of masculine energy in to self-ownership. And it becomes very but I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that's a good analogy maybe is the feminine created this painting, it was just an expression of my soul. And I feel like that's the difference between art and craft. It could be a velvet Elvis painting, but if it's an expression of your soul, that's, in my mind, that's art. And so that's the feminine creating this piece. Then the masculine can, whatever the next task is for it, maybe to have it at an art gallery or something, it takes it there and then can hold space to protect the feminine creativity.
Yeah. Yeah, because I do think the masculine's job is to create safety, is to create structure and boundaries around something so that the feminine can do the creative process. It's very much the experience I had while developing the podcast that I host. It's the change I most want to see in the world, this transformation around masculinity. And yet it's the thing that scares the crap out of me. It's right near my own wound. And so I spent a lot of time in the development and creative process being really worried about how it was going to be received, how myself as a gay man was going to be received having a conversation around masculinity, because my whole life I've been told that I failed as a man from the moment I walked into this world because of my sexuality. And so the anger that's present in that lack of value in my experiences, instead of going and using it on other people, I've turned it into the birthplace of my passion that says, while I might not be offered a seat at the table around this conversation, I'm going to sit down at this table and have this conversation. I'm going to take up space. I'm not going to apologize for it. I think that I have something valuable to offer to this conversation around masculinity. And so that's where it becomes, you hone it and it becomes the passion that helps you create safety around the creative force that was coming through me that wanted to bring
this. Yeah. You hone it and then you own it. I think that's really what I've come to understand in transforming myself is I've gotten rid of the labels, because I think it's too easy for me to get sidetracked and start to then morph myself into what this is as a label.
It's a beautiful act of rebellion in a generative sort of way. Is we're so trained to be externally referenced, to seek our value, and what if we're creating something that people want, if people are buying it, if we have enough money, if we have the right enough body, if people desire us.
Right.
We're so trained to be externally referenced. And so it's this beautiful act of rebellion to turn that towards internal reference, where we get to define our own definitions of these things. We get to decide what we want to wear, how we want to look, how we want to present, who we want to sleep with, who we want, how much wine we want to have. Like, we get to have our own definition and empowerment and ownership of our own life that is radically different from what we've been trained to do.
Yes.
And yet I think it's what we need to do. If
Absolutely.
If more people are able to do that, I think that we get to, there's so much more freedom. And my sense of people that are actually truly free is they rarely have a desire to harm another or to take power from another, because they have this sort of self-ownership piece.
Yes.
It doesn't need to take from another.
And I think that's in, and I get stuck on a few pieces of this, but I think when we have sovereignty over our own bodies and our own spirits, everything balances itself out. And I don't think people are innately destructive. I think we have a need for territory, but that can be different. That can be blurred, especially as we're evolving, hopefully as humans. But when that sovereignty is taken, I know everything going into my mouth. I don't just listen to a doctor and say, you need to take this pill and do this. I'm the only person that can say that, and I want to know everything from within, so that without. The question I have now that just keeps coming up is when you're working with the horses and connecting into that energy, how does that relate to coaching and helping people in their everyday lives?
Well, it's one of my favorite activities to do with clients, because it is the embodiment of sort of this balance of masculine and feminine energies. And it is a full embodied experiential style of learning. I think we as humans have spent a lot of time in classrooms sitting very still with one person at the front of the room knowing all the information, and we're supposed to guess it. And there's shame in our education system based on the grading system. Whereas taking people out into nature, into an interaction with another being, in movement, in your body, connected to the soul, connected to another being, I think it has this beautiful way of returning us back to the way we sort of evolved to learn. And so I actually really love doing it with my male clients, because one of the things I think that is missing oftentimes is we don't teach men about empathy. We don't teach men to put themselves in someone else's shoes and really value their impact on another person. And so when I take men out into a round pen with a horse, and none of the work that I do is writing, it's all on the ground, it's all relationship building. I take all the normal control mechanisms away, except for the round pen that sort of holds a smaller space for us to interact. But now you have to build a relationship with a being that doesn't speak the same language as you do. Yeah. And what happens is, because the animal's so sensitive, it's reading your hormone rate, your respiration rate, your heart rate, your muscle tension, not from a place of hypervigilance and fear, but from a place of just scanning their environment to see if they're safe. And they're herd-based animals, so they know strength in numbers. And when you take them away from the rest of their herd, they're going to start assessing the other beings in the space. Are you safe enough to sort of have a herd with? They're never going to look at me as a horse, but they're going to look at me as another being that helps create safety with them. And so they respond to that, not from a reactionary place of like building a story against you, of like, oh, that person's not safe and they're doing something wrong. But they just naturally respond and trust themselves and move away from things that don't feel good to them, but move into things that do feel good to them. And so people get to see a real-time interaction, in the interaction, real-time feedback on how their inner world and the stories they're telling themselves and the way that they move through the world, how it impacts the external environment. If it's not working for you, if it's limiting you, we get to do some of the typical coaching work that I do, shift some patterns, allow you to go back out and see if it has a different impact on the being that you're in the space with, in this case, the horse. And so you get real-time feedback that's not based in human stories. You get real-time feedback from another being that says, how is this going? Are we connected? Are we not connected? Am I feeling, is there too much pressure put on me? Is there not enough pressure put on me? What's this relationship doing? And that horse shows me often people's views on intimacy, their views on boundaries, their views on leadership, their views on following, what people do in the unknown. Because the experience is, a lot of people don't know what they're doing when they're interacting with a horse on the ground without the control mechanisms. And so they go, I don't know what to do. Okay, well, who are you when you don't know what to do, when you face the unknown? We did a lot of really important conversations that then we get to apply to your outside world and say, how is this showing up, just like what we saw here in this moment?
Yeah, I've done Equus coaching with you, and I find you can't fake it. And that's what I really love about it. It's like the universe's biofeedback. So when I would get frustrated trying to get the horse to do what I wanted it to do, thinking that was the exercise. I'm so goal-oriented. Coel, or you gave us an exercise. I'm like, I'm going to get this done. And everyone around me is going to do the same thing. And we're going to reach our goal in record time. Very
masculine.
Yeah. And it's going to be done in record time. Let's go. And, when that wasn't happening, then anger comes up. And all of that stuff that happened in the arena, I don't know, it was 10 minutes, 15 minutes. That was everywhere in my life.
Yeah.
Beautifully.
That's the biggest question that we ask is, where else is that showing up in your life? And then you get to see yourself, you get to see a mirror in front of you. You get to see a version of yourself that you have just been habitually playing out.
Yes.
And now you get to see it from this observer stance and go, oh, wow, that's really having a big impact on my relationships, on my emotions, on my anxiety, on my anger, you get to really look at that, decide whether it's still serving you, and then let's do some work around it and see if it has an impact.
That was it when I was able to see that for the first time, that I was so goal obsessed. I didn't even care what the goal was. It was like I'd been running a marathon or ultra distance run, just pounding it out. And then somebody taps me on the shoulder and is like, there's no finish line. That was the energy I kept putting into everything. Just give me a ditch to dig. Doesn't matter that the ditch doesn't need to be dug. It's just like, I just needed this energy. And after that started unraveling so many things in my life and letting go of that need to accomplish and check the boxes.
It takes everything that I do as a coach and adds another layer to it that helps the lesson integrate, because once you've seen the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you've seen the reaction of another being to the pattern, and in this case, it's with a horse, and I think that's somehow better, because we inherently know that animals don't lie to us, whereas we know humans do. And so when someone points out a pattern, you get like, oh, that's just their perspective, and that's just their. But when you see an animal, when you see an animal respond in a certain way to something that's coming up in your internal world, then there's this sort of buy-in piece that's extra. And I think
it's authentic. Again, like I was saying, it can't be faked.
Right. Yeah. As a coach, I totally agree with that. Like my clients can lie to me and fake things and say they're doing certain things, but there's no improvement in a certain thing. And I'm like, But when the animal is responding and I can see the feedback in real time, I get to then point it out, instead of being like, you're not doing what you said you were doing, or this doesn't feel authentic. I get to use the horse's feedback and say, what do you think that means right there?
Yeah.
And so we get to have a slightly less ego-triggering conversation that helps them start to explore and be curious about their own selves, rather than me just coming in and directly over-masculine calling them out and making them feel unsafe, which doesn't serve them either.
Well, and it's tricky to when there's the limiting beliefs that we're so addicted to. It's hard to find any kind of way around them, but that's a beautiful way to do it, because the horse is just being a horse.
Yeah.
You can't really blame him for being a horse. What's something that they could do at home that could help connect to that horse energy?
Well, I mean, your body is an animal as well. One of the things, once people come and have an experience with the horses, one of the things I try to really help them notice is that their body is constantly responding to things in real time that then we override with the mind. And so tuning into the body and the feedback the body is giving to us throughout our days, when we're doing things that we are doing because we feel obligated to, or we should do, or we eat things that don't really feel good to us, or we hang out with people that we don't actually feel safe with, or the body is trying to communicate those things. And if you get in tune with how your body responds in different moments, good, bad, indifferent, then you start to have this horse that you take around with you that is constantly reading the feedback of the environment and telling you whether it feels safe or not, or whether it feels good or not, or in balance or not. And if you start getting curious about what the body is communicating, instead of listening to the tapes of the mind that is habituated and that it is this very social creature that's trying to belong and fit in and stay safe on a social level, and you actually listen to the body has a lot of wisdom to share with you that is just like a horse. There's a lot of research about like how much information the subconscious mind is processing versus the conscious prefrontal cortex, and the number is so extremely different. And that subconscious is a part of the animal. It's the animal that's reading and feeling and can notice when you walk into a room and there's tension in the room, and you can feel it without even having ever known what was going on.
Right.
But we teach even children very early on to sort of not listen to that inner guidance of the body. We teach children to hug people that they don't want to hug.
Right.
We teach them to cross their own boundaries so that they can fit in and belong.
Right.
And yet
we can. I think it's more that we can
it's to
fit
deal
in.
with our own anxiety around that. Yeah.
Don't embarrass me in front of Aunt Margaret.
Totally. And it's also teaching kids, these are skills you'll need to have when you're an adult. You'll have to do things that you don't want to do.
Yes.
And well, I can understand that on a social level. It's also a really interesting concept to teach us, to teach our children, and to teach ourselves over and over and over again, to not trust yourself. And I think this body can actually be such a helpful tool to help us understand how to create the life that we really want, that really nourishes us, that's alignment with our dharma, with our soul, with our the purpose in the world. And it takes practice to tune into that versus always listening to the stories of the mind.
Yeah, and it's a good practice to get into, but at first it seems awkward. And is this my gut instinct, or am I, I've got gas?
And sometimes it's just gas.
Sometimes it's just gas. but once you start tuning more into it, you get definite, very clear readings on what direction you should take, or what people are toxic in your life, what people are extracting energy, what people are giving energy, and to calibrate that as if you're calibrating the connection with a horse, without actually having to be with a horse. Yeah. So in wrapping up, I always like to ask people who their biggest teacher is.
I've got a couple that have been very personal to me. I think the horses have been a huge teacher for me. Because I didn't grow up around horses. I rode a couple of times as a kid, but it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I actually really had my first experience interacting with a horse on this level. Wow. And so they've changed my ideas of leadership. They've changed my ideas of relationship, around co-creation, around the sensitive being that I am, interacting with another being that's very sensitive, and interacting with them on the outside of myself. It helps me learn tools for how to navigate and be in relationship with the sensitive being that I am, and my nervous system that can get sensitive sometimes. And so the horses have been a really big teacher. I think for me also, the concept of shame has been a huge teacher in my life. Because I internalized so much shame really early on, and I had tied it to my sexuality, and then I learned to try to be perfect in other different ways to cope. I think sort of the untying of my relationship to the shame that I integrated has been a huge teacher, and is infused in every bit of coaching that I do. And I find that most of my clients come to me looking for, with some level of shame. I don't know how you live in our culture and not have shame embedded in you. And so for me, the untying process and the unlearning process of the original shame wound that was there has been a huge teacher for me, and continues
that's
to be.
beautiful. Yeah, I really like that you have shame as a teacher, because I'm just embedded with shame, and realize that was why I had so much self-hatred growing up. But to look at it as now as a teacher, befriend all those parts of ourselves that haven't led us in the right direction. But I think maybe friending them in that way, having them as a teacher now, I think that's just beautiful transcendence.
Yeah, I mean, I think at any point in any of our healing and transformation journeys, there is a transformation from the old way of navigating it to a new way that is important. I don't look at, especially with like trauma work, I don't look at it personally as a healing journey. I don't think you heal and mend it as if it was never there. I think you transform your relationship to it, and you allow it to still inform who you are, because it is a part of your experiences, is an important part of your past, but it no longer unconsciously and subconsciously drives you. It becomes a conscious player that you then now learn with and from.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. And thank you so much, Travis, for doing this podcast. And thank you for admitting that you're a sensitive man, and for explaining to us in a way that I can understand masculine and feminine. And thank you for making me a smarter person.
You're so welcome. Thanks for asking me to be a part of this with you.
Absolutely.